Newsfirst, Newsline.
A very good evening and welcome. This is Newsline Live here on Newsfirst on TB1. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Jaimal Ratnayaka, filling in for our usual host Farah Shaukat Ali, who is feeling somewhat rather under the weather today. Nevertheless, the show must go on, and today's topic is of very high importance, and the title of today's program is The Taxman Strikes. As you know, there's a very famous saying that goes, there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. And taxes have been the talking point this week in Sri Lanka amid a myriad of economic crises, a myriad of issues. So to talk about this in more depth, we have invited to our studios tonight Chayu Damsinghe. He is an economist. Thank you very much, Chayu, for joining me this afternoon to dissect this very, I would say, complex matter, because I believe the general public of Sri Lanka have to be aware of how their taxes are paid and how their tax money is utilized by the government. Chayu, on the outset of the program, let me ask you, we know that the Inland Revenue Amendment Bill was published earlier this week. Yes, it is still a bill. Yes, it has to be passed in Parliament to be an act. However, if it is passed and it does come in as legislation, income until 100,000 rupees will only be tax-free. Earlier, it used to be a much higher percentage. It used to be a higher threshold, and it has also proposed for corporate tax to have been increased from 30% from 24%. So how will this affect the citizens of Sri Lanka? Can you just tell me in very simple terms how these proposed tax amendments will affect the citizens of Sri Lanka?
Right. So this goes along with a lot of the other measures that are also coming along. So it's not just the tax measures in isolation, and it's part of this overall policy package the government is taking on. So I think that's also a critical part of understanding it. So it's not that the government is only doing tax changes and ignoring the rest. It's coming along with all of it.
Right.
For the average Sri Lankan, this does not directly affect them too much. That's the reality of it, because income tax in Sri Lanka's context only applies to a certain portion of the population. Yes, I'm not saying that all Sri Lanka is rich, but the top 10-15% of the population would be eligible for income tax.
Right.
And that's not to say that the top 10-15% of Sri Lankans are rich. It's just a statement on how poor Sri Lanka overall ends up being. But for that, and especially in urban centers in Colombo, in the Western Province, then that's a much larger percentage of the people there. It's not 10-15% of people in Colombo, it's much larger percentage there. Yes, you're going to be affected, and that's frankly going to be quite hard, quite painful. So different people will get affected at different levels. So for example, someone might struggle with the kind of savings that they might have wanted to keep up, and now you have to cut down on the future savings plans you might have had, because you need to now pay some of these taxes, especially noting that this is coming from a very low tax base after the tax cuts in 2019. So it's a big shift upwards, a sudden shift upwards. Someone else might have to change some consumption patterns, and and some of these consumption patterns might be quite difficult as well. If especially in the space of the last 2-3 years, you've taken a housing loan, a car loan, making choices on those is going to be tough. Then there's no way around it, and no one should say that's not a problem. That's very much a problem. Yes, it's not as much of a problem, for example, as choosing between 1 meal a day versus 2 meal a day, but that doesn't mean the fact that's still a problem nevertheless. So these problems will be there, and what these will end up meaning in the short term, yes, there will be difficult choices to be made. Consumption choices, consumption patterns will change. The benefit really, and the idea behind this is that the government now has an ability, an easy way, a quick way to get some sort of tax revenue to keep the government functioning. So that is critical part right now to make sure that the government doesn't stop functioning. It's not just about state sector salaries or the like, but it's also about just the basic things like keeping the lights on, making sure the roads function, making sure imports and exports happen, the ports are working out. So across the board, to make sure that the government and all the services it provides function. If not for this, the government would either be forced to borrow at increasingly high rates. We know that interest rates are quite high, and that cost also applies to the government as well. It can probably handle that for some time, but handling that for months and months and months on end probably is going to become increasingly difficult. And all the other option would have been to print money, and over the last few years we have seen what that means. Money printed, more consumption of imports, depreciation and inflation, and we are dealing with the consequences of money printing right now. So it is a mixed bag, especially for the people that it directly affects. There will be pain, and that pain is going to be hard. There's no question about it. But the idea behind it is that this is part of a bigger reform package that helps bring down inflation, that helps deal with the crisis that we're facing, and it's a critical part, yet only a part of getting Sri Lanka out of this very, very deep crisis we're in.
You spoke about this being a small part of a much larger reform package in terms of reviving Sri Lanka's economy. So this is viewed as another form of fiscal consolidation by the government. Do you suppose that the government has taken a step in the right direction by proposing these tax hikes?
So my view, and again my personal view, not reflective of anyone else's, is that yes, this was a difficult step, but I think it was a necessary step. Yes, it's sudden, but I also feel that even that suddenness was necessary. Because the alternative of waiting when the government coffers are running dry, I think that the cost of that are far too much. The cost of that is inflation, the cost of that is depreciation that will be felt by everyone, including those who had to pay taxes and those who don't have to pay it. And especially when inflation is already high, yes, tax hikes on top of that can feel bad, but without tax hike, it's very possible that inflation could last even longer and go to an even higher.
Because I asked you this question because opponents of these proposed tax hikes have said that this should have been done gradually instead of all at once, especially at a time when Sri Lanka is facing an unprecedented economic crisis. Inflation is running rampant, and prices are skyrocketing as we speak. So that is why I asked you, and you do believe that this is a progressive step?
Yes, it does in a way sound counterintuitive, right? When things are at a really bad place, why do you want to put more burden onto the people, especially, yes, it's a relatively limited subset of the population, but still it's a subset of the population. Why do you want to put this burden onto them? It, I think, also stems from the fact that Sri Lanka's crisis, this overall crisis, everything we're going through really stems very largely from the fact that we cut taxes in 2019. That really exacerbated any problem that we could have faced. And especially the fact that we moved from a country that had relatively low revenue numbers anyway to one of the worst in the world. And I'm not saying we had bad tax numbers, somewhat not good tax numbers. We're literally among the worst. I think it is only Somalia and Sudan, countries which don't control vast amounts of their own territory, who barely have the equivalent of an inland revenue service, who have lower revenue numbers than Sri Lanka. So that's a terrible place to be in. Out of like 200 countries in the world, countries or territories that are administering taxes and revenue, Sri Lanka is literally one of the poorest governments in the world. So when you're at that kind of situation, waiting for the situation to get even worse, running the risk of inflation going to 100, 150,
reaching hyperinflationary levels.
Exactly. That it's a huge risk, and yes, this is painful for the population. Yes, I agree with that, but I think it's a lesser pain than we otherwise might have had to face. We can't ignore the fact that the pain is there and the consequences that it brings across the board, and different other things that could have been done. But the pain is real, but the alternative would, in my view, been significantly worse.
Do you think this was a knee-jerk reaction by the part of the government? Because fiscal consolidation was one thing that was highlighted by even the IMF delegation that came here, that initially agreed for a bailout scheme. We do not know when the first tranche of that $2.9 billion will come to Sri Lanka, but they stressed on fiscal consolidation. So do you think the government took a knee-jerk reaction? What sort of long-term consequences will we have to face as a result of this? So
I wouldn't call it a knee-jerk reaction, but the fact that the government recognizing that they don't have time to wait. There's no time to find the ideal perfect solution. Wait, for example, one argument that I'm hearing, and it's a fair argument, that if there's so much corruption, when there's questions about expenditure misallocation, why do taxes come in first? Why not those things come in first? The reason is those things take time. you can't reform Sri Lanka's expenditure system overnight. You can't sell SOEs overnight. You have to, I mean, they're debt-ridden SOEs. No one would want to buy a company that has 10 years of bad debt. You'll have to deal with those problems. These things take time. Even fixing corruption. I mean, realistically, there's no country in the world that has fixed corruption. So, we can make improvements, and we should make improvements, but these things take time. So I think the government did recognize the fact that they need to take steps quickly, and this was one step that they could take quickly and actually bring in, from the macroeconomic side of things, results quickly as well, because the tax revenue does come in immediately from this month onwards. So you don't have to wait for a while. And it's also part of the fact that even in the past, Sri Lanka's governments have consistently promised things and said, look, we will do this in the future, we'll do that in the future, but never really go ahead and do that, right? So in that context as well, I think it's also important, given that Sri Lanka has taken policy mistakes that led us down to this point, to prove to the IMF in order to engage with that process, but also to the rest of the world that we're not just promising, making empty promises for the future, but we are taking steps right now as well. I mean, the specific balances of the taxes, someone might have done it slightly differently, but I think broadly the idea behind it and the overall numbers, I think, would have been very difficult to avoid once we got into the crisis that we did. Unless the crisis, we want to prolong the crisis without getting this recovery quite quick, we'd have had to go through this pain.
So you brought out a very important point in your explanation. You spoke about corruption, and when these taxes are hiked in such a manner, the general public, the masses, who are so used to facing and hearing about corruption in the system of governance in Sri Lanka for prolonged years, they might have their reservations on whether these tax funds, whether their own hard-earned money that they pay eventually as taxes, will be put to good use by the government to actually revive the country. What sort of explanation can you give to the people who have their own reservations in terms of this particular aspect?
I mean, I share those reservations, really, because that's a serious, legitimate concern, right? We pay our taxes. What are those taxes really going to be used for? There is a view that Sri Lanka has, a lot of expenditure problems, huge expenditures. That's not necessarily factually accurate. Our expenditure numbers are in the bottom 25% of countries in the world and even in Asia. So it's not that we have huge expenditure numbers, but it's more akin to, say, you have a car that can fit 5 people, all 5 of them are trying to sit in one seat. And the problem is not that the car has too many people, it's just that everyone's trying to sit in one seat. That's the kind of expenditure problem we have. And yes, that happens due to corruption, due to a lot of the cronyism that we have in Sri Lanka, right? Once we pay our taxes, will this tax money be used to pay off, or give a project to a friend of the politicians?
Yes.
Will they be used to give jobs in lieu of the next election? These are legitimate concerns, but the thing is, we can't really solve these concerns without having taxes in the first place as well, right? Even if we're talking about law enforcement officials being trained, if we're talking about having more highly skilled, highly trained people in the anti-bribery commissions in those institutions, we need to pay them. We need investment for that, and that, once again, unfortunately, means these tax hikes to come in. It is very much a chicken and egg situation, and I understand very much that it feels extremely unfair for the people to make these sacrifices when there's no guarantee that the politicians and our leaders and the institutions, the system of governance, will do the same as well, whether the belt tightening will happen at the top as well. I think that is an unfortunate situation. One way that I see out of it is that now, because we have, especially as taxpayers, an incentive to say, look, we are paying our taxes now, go ahead and fix this. Now you must change it. And I think there is an opportunity here for us as taxpayers to make that call. So I think, when you look at some other countries, that kind of change has happened as well. It's not perfect by any means. We're not getting, turning our system of governance into one of idealization, immediately. That's not going to happen. But this does provide an additional opportunity for us to,
have a bigger stake in the system of governance.
Bigger stake in the system, and possibly start changing that as well. And yes, it's going to be painful. It does feel unfair, because it is unfair. But unfortunately, that is the reality that we have, ended up in, and we'll have to make the best of it that we can, really.
Right. We are in conversation with Chayu Damsinghe. He is an economist. We are talking all things taxes in Sri Lanka, because taxes have dominated the headlines over the course of this week. We must now cross over to tonight's headlines for the primetime news. We will be right back. Stay tuned to Newsline on TV1.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back to Newsline here on TV1. We are in conversation with Chayu Damsinghe about taxes in Sri Lanka. We've been having a very insightful conversation until now. Chayu, I want to pick your brain more in terms of brain drain. We are reflective of the youth in Sri Lanka, and as a result of this economic crisis, many young professionals, many learned professionals have been compelled to seek better opportunities abroad. We have seen the serpentine lines in front of the Department of Immigration to obtain passports, to go overseas, to find better pastures abroad. How will these proposed tax amendments, if at all, contribute to brain drain increasing even more in this country?
Right. So the short answer is, will it cause more people to leave the country, the tax hikes themselves? Quite likely. Will it cause enough people to leave to cause a huge problem in the economy, big talent shortages, put Sri Lanka back decades? Likely not, right? I mean, and this idea of migration and brain drain also comes from the fact that it happens more from, when you look at other countries, when you look at the research, over an extended period of time. Yes, when you have a situation like this where there's immediate economic pain, people do move, and we are obviously seeing that right now. But then the other side of the question is, for many people, yourself included, myself included, and actually for a majority of Sri Lankans, right, not just English educated, highly skilled people, most people, there are better financial economic opportunities abroad. So economically, financially, it makes sense for almost everyone to leave the country, but we haven't. That's the reality. If economic and financial points were the only thing that made sense, most people would have left already, but we don't, because there are plenty of other reasons as well. It can be family, it can be just the culture of Colombo, culture of Sri Lanka that you want to deal with, leaving your friends,
You're rooted in the country.
Exactly, right. And there are other non-financial benefits to Sri Lanka as well. I mean, one thing I've recently been hearing is that, when you're in Sri Lanka, it's easier to be a big fish in a small pond, because Sri Lanka is a smaller country, whereas abroad you're more of one cog.
Greater connections.
Exactly. A lot of these things are, there are non-financial benefits. So I'm not necessarily convinced that economic reasons alone are going to make everyone suddenly pack up their bags and leave. It's also the fact that leaving, migrating, is not an easy decision anyway, right? There are lots of steps along the way, and I mean, as a joke, I also say it's also not like you can go to the visa office and say, why do you want to leave the country? I don't like to pay my taxes. They're not going to let you in that case. But it's a process, right? And it's not something you do overnight. I think more than the tax hikes themselves, and there will be people who leave just on that basis as well. But I think it's just the overall economic climate. It's everything that happens since the start of the year that's rather making people leave the country. Yes, some people who are on the fence might now be on the other side of the fence and wanting to leave the country sooner, perhaps, or making more serious plans, whereas earlier they were just maybe considering it. But I think it's more the fact that there's an overall sense of some people, especially at the skill level, leaving the country, and that is going to affect some sectors, some industries, some companies. But I don't think that this is the kind of thing that completely upends a country. I think Sri Lanka still has a lot to offer, and it's not like Sri Lanka is completely destroyed and there's absolutely nowhere to go. And even if you take tax hike, it's not like other countries don't have taxes. Most of them have higher taxes than Sri Lanka does as well. So it's not like you're not paying those anyway. So I think the overall thing on migration that I think is, yes, there will be people who leave, and there will be slightly more people who leave because of this. But I think the big number leaves, not just of this, but the overall situation. But even that, I don't think is large enough to completely decimate the Sri Lankan economy. There will be individual companies, individual sectors that face trouble in the short term. But we've seen these periods of migration in the past. We saw it with the latter stages of the war, earlier stages of the war. There were moments, and even earlier when you had other ethnic problems as well, we saw huge groups of people leaving the country. It's not like that caused this massive problem that destroyed the Sri Lankan economic story, right? Sri Lanka moved along. It's not like we had years and years upon recession. Growth might have been a little bit slower, but you go along, and I think I don't foresee a big change from that story on the migration front. It's possible that if we didn't have this crisis, maybe we could have avoided that. But I mean, I wasn't very confident that Sri Lanka will avoid bad things happening. Anyway, I think Sri Lanka's story has generally been things going wrong here and there. So people will make decisions based on that. That's my view. It's a problem, no doubt about it. But I don't think it's this life-altering, economy-destroying problem.
The Sri Lankans continue to be resilient in the face of adversity.
It's always been there, right? I mean, one thing that I've personally felt is that one thing that characterizes Sri Lanka is the resilience of its people, right? So I think that remains. And those who stay behind, in fact, are now in higher demand. They have higher skills. They have grown more skills, soft skills, even in the middle of a crisis. So there are opportunities, additional opportunities that come up here. This current moment is, of course, very tough. There's no question about it. But there is a path forward, and I'm broadly confident that even on the migration front, it's not going to be this completely terrible thing that absolutely decimates the progress of the country.
Right. Chayu, I want to talk to you about how these taxes, if they are passed, these proposed tax amendments, how they will be collected. Tax administration is another talking point in Sri Lanka, where certain factions of society, the more affluent segments of society, somehow conveniently avoid taxes. They are very much capable of paying taxes, but they avoid paying taxes. How can the government tackle this situation to ensure that there is confidence in all levels, all segments of society, that each and every citizen is paying for their own well-being, instead of the lower segments paying and the ones that are well off conveniently ignore or are given certain tax breaks?
So that is a critical part of the reform, right? It's not just the tax levels and tax rates themselves, but one of Sri Lanka's biggest tax problems is this problem of administration of collection, right? So part of that is a big chunk of that collection issue, in fact, came from exemptions provided, and a lot of loopholes in the tax code that allowed for exemptions to be provided, a lot to corporates as well. So what we are seeing now here is that not only as part of Sri Lanka, but as part of this global, there's this global push to move towards this 30% corporate tax rate. So that's part of the reason I think, that's my understanding, is why some of these rates have been moved up to that 30% mark instead of something else. And a lot of these tax exemptions, even in Sri Lanka's case, have now been removed. So that does bring a significant chunk of people into the tax net, because it's not just the companies, but once a company is in the tax net, everyone else across the supply line, everyone who's employed, everyone,
that entire gamut is affected.
Exactly. Everyone now starts to be a little bit more into the tax net as well. That's not everyone, and like I said, that administrative problem, collection problem still remains massively. So again, this is a moment where we as taxpayers can really push and say, look, start going after this as well, start fixing this problem as well. It's not an easy problem to solve, right? It's not, because it's a problem that's getting worse and worse for decades. Solving it even over the course of a few months is going to be really, really, really tough. I don't know if any country has ever done that. I think over the course of the next year, there will be progress. There are steps being taken, as I understand it as well, but there will be some progress made over the next year or so. It won't be enough. I will not be satisfied with the progress to be made, the progress that I'm expecting to see. But I think it's definitely something to focus on. Getting more and more people into the formal system, both tax and otherwise, allows for this to happen. For example, there is a push now to start integrating the financial system into the tax net more. Not the companies themselves, but like how accounts are done and how auditing is done. Once again, though, in order to do all this, we need to invest in our taxation systems, right? Inland revenue is not very well funded. The issues with the computerized system, training, payments to staff, the prevalence of skilled staff to handle one of the most important parts of our economy. These are things that we need to invest in. So I mean, as one important first step, we also do need to raise tax revenue first, and then we do definitely need to invest there and actually move on this administration problem, because unless we fix this administration problem, I don't know how sustainable these tax rates are for the long term, right? I mean, politically, I'm sure, if you're talking about 10, 20 years down the line, this is not going to be enough. There's going to be more tax requirements to be made, because all of this might get Sri Lanka to a somewhat barely manageable revenue numbers, but these are not going to be good revenue numbers. To get to good revenue numbers, to get to a level where we can really invest in our education, in our healthcare, welfare, we need to fix this administration problem. And this is an opportunity to really push for it. People have the incentive to ask for it, where they might not have had that in the past, because it's in their best interest now. So hopefully that action point does get used right now, and taxpayers do start using that to it might be in their vote, it can be in terms of conversation, civic education, whatever it is that pushes these things, really pushes these things forward. Hopefully that gets done, and I mean, my view is that enough of it will be done to get enough of a benefit, but there is also an opportunity to do much more than that as well.
In your own view, what is the ideal scenario for Sri Lanka? Let's assume that the government gets its act right, the citizens fall in line with the government, the citizens provide full support, the economy starts to revive itself, or we contribute to the revival of the economy. How long will it take for Sri Lanka to reach at least levels that we had pre-COVID, pre-economic crisis, and for Sri Lanka to fall back to, or rather to fall onto, a sustainable path of development, Chayu?
It will take some time. There's no way getting around that. So one of these ideas...
And let me interject, what should be done?
Right. So I mean, one idea, and a critical part of this is that Sri Lanka's past economic story, to an extremely oversimplified it, has been driven by debt that fueled consumption as over to savings or investment, right? So we need to move out of that. So a lot of our economic story right now has been that. So moving away from that is going to be this period of adjustment. So you're no longer going to have that. So your growth rates are going to be slower at the start until you build up your capacity to do things properly. I think we need to start on things we're already good at. And then start look at what are the other opportunities we can relatively easily get into. We don't need to completely reinvent the wheel, and because we do also have very limited resources, focus it on things we can do well. We have tourism, even the ITBP. Yes, this brain drain problem is there, but there are improvements that can be made over the next few years. If not for the fertilizer issue, in fact, agriculture would have been a great savior. But start to get those things back on track. Moving 3, 4, 5 years down the line, energy investments might be a big thing for Sri Lanka.
Tourism.
To get in. Tourism, of course, from the get-go, I think tourism is going to be critical. Long term, there are things, industries we might be able to place ourselves into. There's mineral sands, for example. There's other global things that we can get integrated into. It's going to be hard. We'll have to get our act together for sure. But I think the global story of countries that get into crisis has been things are going to be hard, but gradually, slowly, eventually you get out of it and you get to a significantly better place sometime into the future. It's not going to be a year or two into the future. It might be even 10 years into the future where things are starting to look really good again, but most countries do get there. So my hope, and I mean my general on balance of probability, my view is that we will get there. It's just that it'll take some time. We'll have to do what we must and what we can in the meantime, and go through the pain, push through the pain really until we get there.
Finally, in conclusion, because we are unfortunately running out of time, Chayu, what is your final remarks for Sri Lanka's populace, to everyone who's watching? Do you believe, yes, we are going through a very tough time, but you believe that Sri Lanka is somewhat on the right path? What are your final remarks to our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, things are going to be tough. There's no question about it. And a lot of this pain might feel unfair because it really is, right? I mean, yes, people voted in this government by large margins, but people's voices change. People that I don't think dwelling on the past really helps either. But yes, there will be pain. Pain will be hard, but eventually, pushing through the pain and actually using that pain as an opportunity to get good results and good reforms in, we'll come to a point where we can get onto that path of success. And yes, the next few decades will be difficult, not for Sri Lanka, for the world. Lots of change is happening, but I think we have great opportunity to place ourselves onto the right path that allows us to see through a very difficult time and eventually get onto a place where we are going to be really, really a lot better than we have seen in the past. And I'm broadly confident that eventually we'll get there. It's a question of how long will it take.
Chayu, Damsinghe, thank you very much for joining us today, talking to us about taxes, how important taxes are, and how these taxes will affect Sri Lanka in the short term, medium and long term, and how sustainable development can be achieved in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We will now cross over to the primetime news on TV1. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Chayu Ratnayaka. Take care, stay safe and good night.